Great. So thanks everyone for joining today. I hope you're all having a great start to the droidcon this year. So I'm Hakkim, and I'm heading up the app engineering department called RevStore at Zalando. So if you download the Zalando app, roughly 50% of the customer journeys that you're seeing are built by my teams. But underpinning that, my teams are also building the app platform. So that is to say the infrastructure, the services, and the processes on top of which all customer journeys are built. So today's agenda, I'll give you a quick overview of the Zalando app ecosystem. I'll talk about the why and the what of developer productivity. Then I'll introduce you to some canonical models that theorize how to effectively and practically improve developer productivity. With all that theory behind us, we also look at some of the practices that people are adopting, that the prominent players are adopting, and also talk about how we are applying that at Zalando. And finally, we'll talk about how we executed on all of that theory with reference to our operational plan, looking back at 2023 and forward into 2024. So where possible, I've tried to add screenshots from the original materials like research papers or presentations and so forth. I also created a Medium article at this link which goes into it a little bit more detail than here. Okay, so to give an overview of the Zalando apps landscape, so we have roughly 70 million installs on Android, more or less the same numbers in iOS. Our app visiting customer base grew by about 40% since 2018. And the number of app visits grew by 4 times as compared to web. And this kind of, in general, reflects the trend we're seeing in the industry, where more and more organizations are investing into mobile-first engineering, right, or product development. Okay, so the talking about developer productivity. So there's an anecdote about Jonathan Carter, who's the technical advisor to GitHub CEO, which says that he used to really hate vacuuming, apparently. And turns out the reason is because he used to keep his vacuum on the first floor, and bringing it downstairs to vacuum was quite a tedious thing to do, right? But when he realized this, that he could just keep the vacuum downstairs, apparently it turned out not so arduous anymore, and apparently he vacuums every other day now. I mean, I don't know how much truth there is to this, but nevertheless, I think it's a good analogy to illustrate the difference between the quality of a tool versus the qualitative experience of using the tool. So you're going to find a lot of names, right? You're going to hear things like developer productivity, management, developer experience, and so on. And we're not going to be pedantic about semantics for this presentation. I'm going to kind of interchangeably refer to these terms to all refer to the practice that places the developer at the center and asks how her infrastructure, tooling, and workflows are contributing to her productivity, her job satisfaction, and her operational impact. So why is DevX important? So as Greg Mondello, Director of Product at GitHub, points out, and as we all know, I think in most contexts, software, the limiting factor for innovation in software is development capacity. So if you have 1,000 engineers, you're going to be able to innovate a lot faster than if you had 100. And in today's world of disruptors, organizations that are going to invest into developer productivity are, at least in the long term, going to have a competitive advantage over their competitors. And in today's world where, disruptors and shakers, it could mean the difference between success and failures of many startups. Which brings us to the favorite question that we like to ask at Zalando, which is how do you measure success, right? And there's two approaches here. So engineering metrics are very tangible, concrete, repeatable metrics, measures. And here examples are things like test flakiness, DORA metrics, and lines of code. Then you have more subjective metrics. So surveys are more psychometric in nature, right? And of course, they're inherently subjective as a result. So things like job satisfaction, on-call experience, etc., are inherently very subjective. So I want to take a moment to kind of emphasize how to utilize these metrics in a proper way. And for that, I want to talk about Goodhart's law, named after the famous British economist, that states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, right? Now, take lines of code as an example. It's quite easy to game objective metrics, right? So as a few examples, you could just duplicate the code everywhere, right? You're going to create more lines of code. You could write inefficient code, right? You can write really verbose code. Therefore, you can see why we should take these metrics with a pinch of salt. And also, subjective metrics are also prone to bias, right? So I think we are all kind of guilty of allowing recency bias to influence developer surveys. I had a bad experience with the client team, so therefore I'm more likely to score collaboration negatively if the survey was to come out today, right? So productivity is not performance, and you shouldn't be using this to police people. It should definitely not be used in performance evaluations. The large institutions are not using them in this way. They're mostly using them as enablers of productivity. Okay, so let's talk a bit about some of the models that theorize how to improve productivity. So as early as 2013, Google's DevOps Research and Assessment team, or the DORA team, as many of you would know, they've been running these large-scale developer surveys, and they've been producing the results of their analysis on annual reports since 2014. So they mainly asked a bunch of questions, but the four that stood out are, the first two are deployment frequency and lead time for changes, which speaks to how fast you're delivering software. So moving fast is important, but you also want to ensure that you're moving in a way that you're not breaking things, right? So the second two metrics speak to that, which is MTTR, mean time to restore, and change failure rate. And based on their extensive analysis, the DORA team found that these four, that companies or teams that scored high in these four metrics or these four questions also tend to score very highly on their relative business rankings, right? Business performance ranking. So they concluded that there is a causal link between these delivery metrics and operational or business performance. And they published these results in the 2018 book called Accelerate, right? I think many of you would know this, which made the DORA metrics a household name. Great, so that was 2018, but again in 2021, early 2021, one of the authors of the Accelerate book worked with some researchers at Microsoft and produced the SPACE model of developer productivity. And there they claimed that there are certain pervasive myths that if we don't actively adopt or adapt our model to address them, that these myths will tend to be quite pervasive and will actively harm productivity. So this is what their model looks like. So on top of they have these DORA-like metrics, right? So for example, performance and activity. but they also have very people-oriented metrics like communication and collaboration and flow, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it didn't stop there. So the researchers again released in 2023 another paper which claimed that actually, if you really want to improve developer productivity, you should be improving developer experience. And these are the three sort of dimensions of DevX as the model came to be known: flow state, cognitive load, and feedback loops. So I don't want to go into these models in any more details, but suffice to say, and I'm actually just illustrating this to show you how prominent people are thinking about developer productivity, and also to give you a sense of how fast this field is evolving. Okay, so that comes to Zalando's own, or Zalando Apps, my organization's own model of developer productivity. So we believe that we should ground any kind of strategy in sound principles, right? And one of the best principles that we know is the Me-See principle, which many of you will know was developed by Barbara Pinto during her time at McKinsey. And she's also the author of the Pyramid Principle, which is a fantastic book about writing and logic. So this is a categorization framework that makes it easier to group items in complex systems in a way that makes it easy to analyze and derive useful conclusions from them. So the two categorization rules are, so the first is that every item should be mutually exclusive, which means that, or every category must be mutually exclusive, which means that an item can only belong to one of the buckets at a time, one of the category buckets at a time. And the second rule is that the categories should be collectively exhaustive, which means that all the space of the items or the data records must fall within one of these buckets. So a good example of applying the principle is to group customers by their age. And you can see that, a customer has to fall into one of these age brackets, right? But collectively, the age brackets are exhaustive. So there is kind of a lot of developer productivity models floating around, as I mentioned before. But the one that we liked the most was from Swarmia, who some of you might know are specializing in developing tools for boosting productivity. So to give a mental model of their approach, so they have kind of this black box machine, right? This engineering or product factory, however you want to call it. Then you have features and specifications, for example, in the form of Jira tickets that flow into these black boxes. The black box does its thing and produces product and features as an output, and hopefully some business value as an outcome. So, of course, the features and specification should ideally derive from your company strategy, cascading down through your operational plan, roadmap, and eventually into a team's backlog. So the third dimension is the affect, or the kind of the affective dimension, how the developer perceives the quality and the experience of the work. So to map that mental model to the actual model, so the black box factory, they term the infrastructure. So these are the things that enable engineering execution, right? So things like the programming languages, the dev tools, processes, etc. So very much this infrastructure box or component is about building things in the right way, right? Then I talked about the things that flow into and out of these box, right? And they are referred to in the model as the value of work. So here we're talking about things like strategic alignment that I talked about earlier. And this component is very much about building the right things, right? So building value sustainably. I'll come back to this in a bit more detail. And finally is the affective dimension, which they call feelings about work. And this is about investing into building in the right culture. So putting the model into practice, how do you then tangibly drive great DevX? So the first is, of course, you want to enable better infrastructure by reducing infrastructure friction, right? So that was the first box, addressing the first component. Second is you want to improve the value of work. And the best way to do that is to create business value in an effective and sustainable way. And finally is improving feelings about work, the affective dimension. And this is about investing into an outstanding workplace culture. So I'm going to talk about each of those components, those three components now. So unless you're building a greenfields app, tech debt is bound to be your biggest enemy here, right? This is going to be your biggest blocker for or cause of infrastructure friction. And the problem here often is that tech debt directly competes against customer-facing features for engineering resources, right? And that leaves the engineering managers amongst you with the very unenviable task of having to get buy-in from executive decision makers to invest into addressing tech debt. And here it's really useful to be able to speak the language of the business, right? If you are struggling with that, then there's a fantastic paper by some researchers from the University of Groningen that talks about some approaches to quantify tech debt using financial methodologies. So as an example, so here is some of their approaches they talk about. You can see that portfolio management, cost-benefit analysis, and real options analysis make up sort of the most popular share of these methods. So we wanted to take kind of a bit more of a simplistic approach to also identifying tech debt. So I talked about how to prioritize it and get buy-in, but this is about identifying. And we said, look, we want to place the engineer, we want to place the developer at the center, right? And we said, okay, let's do developer surveys and try to source the three biggest pain points. And the three biggest pain points at Zalando, and I think it's no surprise to those of you who are from the apps world, were slow builds, slow IDE experience, and slow infrastructure setup. So why is build such a big problem if you're not from an apps background, that is? So another GitHub's executive kind of, I think, captures another apt analogy, which says that waiting for builds is like when you're waiting at a traffic light, right? I mean, you really hate to be there. You're not there for very long, right? But you absolutely hate to be there because it's a psychological thing that humans don't like to wait. I mean, compare that to like when you're cruising along on a highway, right? So why is slow build such a problem in the app world? So unlike in the back-end and front-end server-side based systems where you own the deployment environment, in apps, the entirety of your code base is being compiled into a single binary, right, which you're going to launch at a third-party app store and then eventually roll out to your customers. And to address these trends, so now I'm going to start cross-referencing these challenges against popular approaches that have been adopted to address them, right? So to kind of address this problem of these monolithic code bases, what many companies and teams are doing are to decouple the code base into modules, right? When you start doing that, the natural question arises, okay, well, where do I put my code? You know, if I'm going to break it down, it's not one thing anymore. Do I still keep it in one code base or do I split it up? And this concept of a single repository to contain all of the code base or mono repos is something that's been that we're seeing quite widely adopted. Of course, there are companies like Microsoft and Netflix who are kind of quite infamous for having their code across multi-repos. Great, now you've decoupled your code, fantastic. You've started to build modules, but a different kind of problem shows up, right? Because now you have this kind of explosion of modules. So this is a slide from Uber's talk from the DPE Summit a couple of years ago. And this is about 20,000 modules that are kind of dependent on each other, right? So to illustrate this a little bit more data-based in a data-driven way, if you're looking at the backend build targets, it's typically very, very small, right? Like maybe 5 or 10. But you can see for their rider app, for the Uber's rider app, it's close to 150. So one of the things, so that's the challenge. So the solution to this that we're seeing a lot of institutions adapt is to invest into build engineering optimizations. And that very often takes the form of investing into a more sophisticated build tooling. So this is an example from the Apple Siri team, who over the course of a year migrated their repository or migrated their build system to Gradle Enterprise. So the magic behind this system is that they have this little client library, this daemon running, agent running in the client system, which on the background consistently watches the code base and keeps track of changes. So at any moment, it knows exactly what files have changed and back up the dependency tree of the subsection of the graph to build. So according to the Apple Siri team, they claim that the Gradle daemon and the test parallelization contributed to the biggest productivity wins. They also published this, which is some stats around their before and after stats. So overall, they saved a total of 11 minutes in build time, which across the 350-strong team equates to roughly 16,500 engineering hours over the period of a year. So another kind of, maybe not so much a challenge, but another opportunity that shows up when you start investing into the sophisticated tooling is the immense amount of data that these systems provide. And then the onus is then on sort of the platform or the DevOps teams to try to utilize this information. So a lot of teams, a lot of prominent organizations are investing into improving or creating build observability systems. So here again is an example from Uber, their LDA system. So their design kind of works like this. So they have these data collectors which send data or logs through to a queue, which is then dispersed to a save and a big data store, to a search and a big data store, sorry. So the benefits of doing things is that you're enabling your engineers to be able to debug, build issues faster, right, more efficiently and effectively. And the other thing you're doing is if you build monitoring on top of this and alerting, is that you allow or you enable your builder infrastructure and incident teams to respond to builder-facing incidents much faster. So another really cool trend that's coming up is cloud IDEs, right? And cloud builds. So this is from Airbnb. So Android Studio, again, built on top of JetBrains. So what they've done is they've taken this JetBrains engine, or this IDE engine, and they've allowed you to put this engine somewhere else, for example, in the cloud. And what that means is that you can be sitting on a fairly run-of-the-mill machine, and be accessing high-end resources. So laptop resources limitations is not a problem anymore. You can have the builds, the images that are running, you can have them pre-built and with the build cache pre-warmed, right? Which means that the setup time is completely diminished, and there are no more local builds, right? You can potentially create multiple builds up in the cloud. Okay, so how to reduce infrastructure? In summary, these are some of the ways, right? So referencing the challenges and the opportunities, investing into modularization, observability, optimizing build, and employing remote IDEs. For us, each minute saved roughly 400 engineering hours per year, which I think is really huge for a single minute. So we've done the first box, right, the black box, and the second box or second component is the value of work. So here we are talking about creating customer value sustainably. The problem that many engineering managers or institutions face is that not just engineering managers, but maybe it also lends itself to the pressures on them, is that they take this flawed reasoning that, hey, if I absolutely need to, and a project becomes late, I can always throw more people at it, right? And therefore, I don't need to worry about continuously cleaning up my code base. So the graph is from a large scale, possibly the largest scale engineering research that was done, which showed that up to only 40% of engineers actually invested into addressing tech debt, while 60% of them of time is actually spent on tech debt related issues, right? So that's the discrepancy is huge. 10% and 42%. So the study was done across 40,000 software modules. So it's really an extensive study. And I think the stats are quite worrying, right? So then how do you create customer value sustainably? So this is from Dropbox, and they've got quite a cool way of doing things, right? So what they do is they bucket their work in order to raise transparency to senior executive management. So if you don't, if you're not continuously addressing tech debt, what you're going to end up is the situation on the far right where you're spending most of your time in unplanned work. So the investment buckets framework that I talked about, so what is it? So they have 4 simple categories of grouping work. So the first is building new stuff. The second is improving things. Improving developer productivity and keeping the lights on. So keeping the lights on is things like, the GDPR compliance regulations that we've been struggling with, and I'm sure you have also. So in short, creating customer value sustainably is about aligning, getting buy-in about prioritization principles, and ensure that you adhere to them over time. And this will hopefully lead to also minimizing root causes of firefighting because you're addressing tech debt. And the way very concretely that we approach this is to get 10% buy-in from our executive management, that 10% of every sprint will be spent towards tech debt. And I think this is a fairly reasonable number for many organizations to aim for. Okay, so that brings us to our final part, which is the investing into improving engineering culture. So there are a lot of theories on how to do this, right? But there's just a couple that I wanted to highlight. So the first is this idea of a flow state or flow. So in the graph of challenges against skills, when they are matched with each other, so what your skill sets are, the capability given your current expertise, when that matches the complexity of the challenge, turns out that this is the best space that you want to be in. This is the most interesting and psychologically fulfilling state. Of course, this is from a 2013 research by Schaefer. The one condition that I wanted to point out, reason because it continuously shows up in research, is freedom from distractions. So I think many of you have this experience if you're engineers that you constantly keep getting pulled into meetings, right? And I don't know about you, but I used to absolutely hate that. Meetings are, of course, necessary, right? Don't get me wrong, but I think we need to be kind of careful about creating and maintaining focus blocks. So another quite apt analogy I felt was this by another GitHub exec who says that coding is like building a house of cards in your mind, right? And the moment you get distracted and you have to multitask, then this card of deck of cards falls away. This house of cards falls away. So a very important note is that from a large-scale study called Mind the Gap that was done and combined with Microsoft and Facebook, they found that the longest period of uninterrupted coding time was the highest contributing factor to improving, to subjectively reported measures of productivity. So much so that organizations, this is another pattern, is that organizations are investing into bots to kind of support them, help create and maintain these focus blocks. So FocusBot, for instance, it runs on the background, watches your activity, and where it kind of senses that you're getting into the zone, it starts to silently shut down notifications so you don't get bothered. BalanceBot, so if you have, like in Meta, a large social network which acts as your communication platform, you might get kind of overwhelmed and bombarded with notifications, right? So this BalanceBot aims to kind of do away with that. And what it does is, again, if you're getting too much notifications from a channel, it automatically tones that down and so on. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to explore, is this idea of utilizing bots to improve focus. So that was the trend. I'm going to very briefly touch on this, right, just because according to the DORA research, so the idea of more frequent continuous deployment and shorter feedback cycles leads to not only high quality code and less deployment pain, but it also leads to higher levels of job satisfaction. So this is like an objective. So we talked about a subjective one in the focus. So this is an objective metric that you can try to employ and optimize. So finally, it's great to do all of these things, but you also want to be sure that you have kind of this automated way to ensuring quality, that what you're producing meets a certain quality bar. I think I don't need to dive into this too much, but making releases safe and reliable is about avoiding this concept of drift, right? So when code branches drift too far apart from each other, they change too much, and then merging introduces conflicts, which we want to try and avoid. And again, automating repetitive tasks. Okay, so the last part, which is to run through our strategic initiatives. So I said that, what we don't want to do is to try to reinvent the wheel, right? We want to follow good guiding principles, look at what prominent players are doing in the industry, and you ideally want to emulate them. And where one of those measures don't work out, then you want to innovate, right? Because we don't have the luxury of having a very large team. So here are some of the trends that I talked about and corresponding projects that we invested into at Zalando. So our modularization project and mono repo setup was called Project Roadster. We also migrated to Gradle Enterprise, like the Apple Siri team did. And we moved from a 3-week release to a 2-week release, which I also wrote about in more detail in the Medium blog. So what was the result of all of this? So this is a little bit outdated, I suppose, now that we're in July, but you can, I talked about this explosion of modules, and you can see that happening with our Android code base. With iOS, it's a little bit slower, but we're starting to catch up also. So we didn't have much data before, and today we collect data from roughly 40,000 bills across our departments, which of course opens the door to all kinds of possibilities for collecting and deriving insights. So our average app pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, was 25 minutes, and we decreased that by 20%. And that was a very simple change by enabling remote caching. And we also managed to improve 6% the cache hit rates for our, and this is both for our core design system library, which is essentially used all over our code base. Looking forward, these are, again, looking at the cross-referencing with the industry trends. These are some of the initiatives that we want to try and explore. Noteworthy things are the cloud IDEs and investments into declarative frameworks like SwiftUI and Jetpack Compose, which we've already made quite a lot of headway with. Great, then thank you very much for joining the talk. I hope it was useful. Thank you.